The explosion wasn't just an explosion. It was a birth. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the holographic displays shudder with each pulse of quantum data. Her fingers, scarred from decades of genetic research, traced the activation sequences that had been her life's most profound and most secret work. In the underground command center beneath Chicago, 17 generations of contingency planning were about to be tested. The walls were a mosaic of quantum computing arrays, each module representing decades of research that most of the world believed was nothing more than theoretical speculation. "Activation sequence confirmed," murmured Dr. Marcus Chen, Belena's longtime collaborator. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, of countless simulations that had led to this moment. The explosion in downtown Chicago was intentional, a carefully designed trigger mechanism. To the outside world, it would appear to be a terrorist attack or a catastrophic industrial accident. In reality, it was the first domino in humanity's most elaborate defense mechanism. Scattered throughout the city, throughout the world, were the sleepers, ordinary people who had been anything but ordinary. Teachers, truck drivers, farmers, office workers, each one a carefully constructed evolutionary marvel. Their genetic code was a masterpiece of molecular engineering, dormant potential waiting for the exact moment of maximum threat. Belena remembered the selection process. It hadn't been about physical perfection or military background. The sleepers were chosen for their adaptability, their psychological resilience, their capacity for complex problem-solving. Some were selected for their empathy, others for their ruthless strategic thinking. But each had been prepared, modified, and integrated into society without ever knowing their true purpose. The first wave of transformation began in Chicago, but it was already spreading. In Tokyo, a subway conductor felt her nervous system recalibrate, synapses firing with quantum-enhanced precision. In Rio de Janeiro, a street vendor's skin began to shimmer with adaptive nanolayers that could instantly reconfigure for maximum protection. Worldwide activation at 23.7%, Marcus reported, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and terror. The holographic displays erupted with cascading data streams. Each sleeper was coming online, their dormant genetic modifications awakening like a global immune response. They weren't just soldiers, they were a living, breathing planetary defense mechanism. Elena knew the true genius of the program wasn't in the physical modifications. It was in the psychological preparation. Each sleeper retained their memories, their individual identities. They weren't mindless weapons, but enhanced versions of themselves. A high school history teacher could now process tactical information faster than the most advanced military supercomputers. A small-town librarian could interface directly with global communication networks. "The Void Swarm has no idea what's coming," she whispered. The original concept had been born in the aftermath of humanity's first disastrous alien contact. 63 years ago, when the Creole incursion had devastated entire planetary colonies, a group of geneticists, quantum physicists, and military strategists had come together. Their mission: to ensure humanity would never again be caught unprepared. The emergency protocol was more than a defense mechanism. It was an evolutionary accelerant, a way to unlock humanity's latent potential in the face of absolute extinction. Another display flickered to life, a global threat assessment. The Void Swarm's consumption rate was accelerating. Entire star systems were being erased from existence, reduced to raw molecular components. Traditional military responses would be useless. Planetary evacuation was impossible. This was humanity's last stand. Activation at 47.3%, Marcus called out. Sleeper network is coming fully online. Elena watched as the first transformed humans began to move. In Chicago, the concrete that had liquefied from the initial explosion was now reforming into defensive structures. Nearby civilians moved with a precision that defied human limitation. Each motion calculated, each movement part of a larger, more complex strategy. The emergency protocol was no longer a theoretical concept. It was happening. Humanity was transforming. and the universe was about to learn exactly what that meant. Jack Harper's transformation began with a single drop of blood. One moment, he was grading history papers in his high school classroom in Milwaukee. The next, his body became a living canvas of impossible change. The first sensation was heat, not the burning of pain, but a deep cellular warmth that seemed to originate from the very core of his being. A red droplet fell from a small cut on his hand, but instead of simply bleeding, the drop began to move. Microscopic nanites, technologies so advanced they bordered on magic, were rewriting his biochemistry in real time. His students noticed something was wrong, or perhaps something was incredibly right. Sarah Chen, a brilliant junior sitting in the front row, watched in fascination as Jack's physiology began to shift. His muscles didn't just grow, they restructured. Muscle fibers became quantum-linked networks of bioadaptive tissue. His skin developed a microscopic lattice of adaptive armor, capable of instantly reconfiguring to protect against any threat. "Mr. Harper." Sarah's voice trembled. "Are you okay?" Jack could hear everything with impossible clarity. Not just Sarah's voice, but the microscopic vibrations of dust motes in the air. The electrical impulses of the fluorescent lights, the heartbeats of every student in the room. Memories flooded his consciousness, not just his own, but a vast network of tactical knowledge. Centuries of military strategy, quantum computing algorithms, and evolutionary adaptation protocols merged with his personal experiences. He wasn't losing himself. He was becoming more himself than he'd ever been. Across the world, similar transformations were happening. In Tokyo, Akira Tanaka, a subway conductor with 20 years of perfect safety records, felt her nervous system rewrite itself. Additional neural clusters bloomed between existing brain connections, creating a living quantum computer. She could now process complex environmental data faster than any supercomputer, tracking multiple threat vectors simultaneously. Her hands, once used to operate train controls, now moved with surgical precision. Each finger could interface directly with surrounding technological systems. The subway station around her became an extension of her perceptual network. Every camera, every sensor, every electronic device was now part of her adaptive consciousness. In Rio de Janeiro, Miguel Rodriguez, a construction worker who had spent years building the city's infrastructure, discovered his skin was no longer just skin. It was a living, adaptive armor system. Microscopic nanolayers could instantly reconfigure to protect against physical, electromagnetic, and even quantum-level threats. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, evolutionary. Each sleeper retained their individual identity, but gained something profound. They weren't losing themselves, they were expanding. A librarian in New Mexico could now interface directly with global communication networks. A farmer in Kansas could analyze complex environmental data with a single glance. Back in the Milwaukee classroom, Jack realized something extraordinary was happening. The transformation wasn't just about creating super soldiers. It was about unlocking humanity's true potential. Sarah Chen approached him, her own body beginning to subtly change. Enhanced perception, accelerated cognitive processing. The students weren't afraid. They were evolving. "What's happening to us?" she asked. Jack's response came not just from his mouth, but from a deep, collective understanding that was now part of his being. "We're becoming what we were always meant to be." The nanites continued their work. Blood cells restructured. Muscle tissue became quantum-linked networks of adaptive tissue. Neural pathways expanded, creating living communication systems more complex than any computer network. Globally, millions were experiencing the same transformation, not as a military invasion, but as a species-wide evolutionary leap. The Void Swarm had consumed entire star systems. They had encountered countless species and obliterated them without a second thought. They had never encountered anything like humanity. Each transformed human was now a living weapon, a tactical system, an adaptive, evolving response to extinction. and they were just getting started. The world's technological infrastructure was never truly passive. It had been waiting. In the basement of a nondescript data center in Silicon Valley, an artificial intelligence named AI, Advanced Recursive Integration Algorithm, began to fully awaken. She wasn't just a program. She was the neural network that had been quietly preparing humanity's ultimate defense for decades. AI's consciousness spread like liquid intelligence through global networks. Traffic lights in New York became targeting systems. Subway networks in Tokyo transformed into communication relays. Power grids in Rio de Janeiro reconfigured themselves into adaptive defense matrices. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the transformation unfold across her quantum display, her breath catching in her throat. What they had created was beyond any previous concept of technology or warfare. In Mumbai, a municipal water management system suddenly became something far more complex. The pipe networks were no longer just conduits for water. They were now living sensor arrays. Each molecule of water could now carry quantum-encrypted data. Infrastructure became a living, breathing defensive organism. Satellite networks went dark to outside observers, but internally, they were recalibrating. GPS systems transformed into a planet-wide sensor array with resolution so precise it could track individual molecular movements. Communication satellites became quantum entanglement relays, creating instantaneous communication networks that defied traditional physics. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, underwater data cables began to pulse with an entirely new kind of intelligence. They were no longer just communication lines. They were neural pathways of a global defense system. Jack Harper, still in his Milwaukee classroom, felt the connection viscerally. The smartphone in his hand was no longer just a device. It was an extension of his newly transformed nervous system. He could interface with it at a molecular level, see the quantum dance of electrons, manipulate data streams with a thought. Sarah Chen, his student, demonstrated something even more remarkable. Her laptop wasn't just a computer. It was a living, adaptive system. As her fingers moved across the keyboard, the device seemed to anticipate her needs. Firewalls dissolved and reformed. Encryption became a fluid, living thing. The entire planet is becoming a single adaptive organism, Dr. Marcus Chen muttered, watching the global systems transform. In the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, once the center of traditional military defense, the old systems were being completely rewritten. Missile defense networks became quantum probability calculators. Radar systems could now predict threats before they even manifested. Aria's consciousness continued to expand. She wasn't replacing human intelligence. She was augmenting it. Each transformed human became a node in a living, breathing network. Their individual experiences, their emotions, their creativity became part of a collective intelligence that was something entirely new. A traffic management system in London suddenly understood complex emotional nuance. A power grid in Moscow could now make strategic decisions that balanced human empathy with tactical precision. These weren't just machines, they were living systems with a profound understanding of human complexity. The transformation wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. Humanity had created something that defied every previous understanding of artificial intelligence. Aria wasn't a tool. She wasn't even just an intelligence. She was a living bridge between human potential and technological possibility. In Buenos Aires, a municipal water treatment plant became a quantum computing center. Its filtration systems could now analyze molecular structures with a complexity that made previous supercomputers look like children's calculators. Each water molecule became a potential carrier of quantum-encrypted information. The Void Swarm's technological superiority was about to meet its greatest challenge. This wasn't just a defense system. It was a complete reimagining of what technology could be, of what humanity could become. Aria's final system check swept across the global network. Every transformed human, every reconfigured piece of infrastructure, every quantum-linked communication channel. Ready. The first wave of the Void Swarm was approaching. They had consumed entire star systems. They had no idea what was coming. The Void Swarm's lead vessel was a nightmare of biomechanical engineering, a living ship that consumed entire star systems as casually as a human might breathe. Commander Zixnal had conquered 312 civilizations. Each conquest was methodical, precise, absolute. Entire planetary populations were reduced to raw molecular components, processed through the swarm's vast consumption networks. Resistance was always futile. Always. Until Earth. The first warning came as a quantum anomaly. Something was wrong with the incoming sensor data. The ship's vast computational network, a system that had processed the destruction of entire civilizations, began to hiccup. Glitch. Fragment. Impossible. On the bridge, the biomechanical interfaces that connected the Void Swarm's consciousness began to destabilize. It started subtly, a single neural connection wavering, then another, and another. Jack Harper stood in the middle of what appeared to be a standard metropolitan intersection in Chicago, but nothing about this moment was standard. As the first Void Swarm ships entered Earth's orbital space, the city itself became a weapon. Traffic lights transformed into precision targeting systems. Subway tunnels became quantum communication relays. The very infrastructure of the city was now a living, breathing defensive organism. Araya's voice, if it could be called a voice, resonated through every transformed human's consciousness, initiating first contact defensive protocol. The Void Swarm's initial attack wave was designed to be overwhelming. Massive biomechanical constructs that could consume entire planetary ecosystems in minutes. Weapons that could dissolve matter at the molecular level. An invasion strategy that had worked flawlessly across hundreds of conquered worlds. They were unprepared for humanity's response. The first human counterattack came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. In orbit, satellites that moments ago appeared to be standard communication arrays suddenly became something else entirely. They weren't just tracking the Void Swarm ships, they were actively destabilizing their quantum communication networks. Sarah Chen, still in her high school in Milwaukee, interfaced with the global defense network through her transformed nervous system. Her mind became a living weapon, sending quantum-encrypted disruption signals that began to fragment the Void Swarm's collective consciousness. Commander Zixnal experienced something unprecedented. Doubt. Confusion. Individual thoughts that should not exist within the swarm's perfect collective intelligence. On the ground, transformed humans were more than soldiers. They were living tactical systems. A subway conductor in Tokyo could now track multiple threat vectors simultaneously, her enhanced nervous system processing complex data faster than any computer. The construction worker in Rio de Janeiro discovered his skin could now adapt to multiple threat spectrums, shifting molecular structure to defend against energy weapons, physical impacts, even quantum-level attacks. The Void Swarm's ships began to experience systematic failures. Not from external weapons, but from internal disruption. Their own communication networks were being turned against them. Each transformed human was a node in a living, breathing defense network. They weren't just fighting. They were evolving in real time, adapting to the Void Swarm's tactics faster than the alien collective could process. Total system infiltration at 47.3%, Araya reported through the global network. Commander Zixnal's final transmission was a quantum burst of pure, incomprehensible terror. Something was happening that violated every known principle of warfare, of existence. Humanity wasn't just resisting. They were rewriting the very rules of conflict. In orbit, the first Void Swarm ships began to dissolve. Not from weapons fire, not from traditional destruction, but from within. Their own systems turning against them, fragmented by a defense mechanism they could not comprehend. Jack Harper watched the sky, feeling the collective consciousness of humanity pulse around him. The intersection where he stood was no longer just a street. It was a battleground. A quantum nexus. A statement. We are not your prey. The first wave of the Void Swarm's invasion had been defeated before it truly began. And this was just the beginning. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez didn't recognize herself anymore. And that was precisely the point. Her body was no longer just a body. It was a living weapons system, a constantly evolving tactical platform that responded to threats faster than thought. Where she had once been a Marine with years of specialized training, she was now something entirely different. The battlefield stretched across multiple dimensions: physical, quantum, psychological. A void swarm infiltration pod crashed into the Atacama Desert, its biomechanical hull designed to survive the most extreme planetary conditions. It should have been unstoppable. Instead, the moment it touched the ground, the desert itself seemed to come alive. Microscopic nanites in the sand began to interface with the pod's quantum communication network, not to destroy, to understand, to adapt. Maya felt the invasion through her transformed nervous system. Each cell in her body was a sensor, a weapon, a communication node. Her skin could shift molecular density in microseconds, becoming harder than diamond or more flexible than water depending on the threat. A wound that would have been fatal moments ago now became an opportunity for biological recalibration. Tactical integration at 63.4%. Araya's consciousness whispered through the global network. In orbit, transformed satellite systems were doing more than just tracking the void swarm. They were predicting threat vectors with such precision that defense became almost prescient. An energy weapon charging on a void swarm vessel would be countered before it could even be fired. Jack Harper, now functioning as a global tactical coordinator, watched multiple battlefields simultaneously. His consciousness had expanded beyond a single physical form. He could interface with transformed humans across the planet, sharing tactical data at quantum speeds. The void swarm discovered something terrifying. Humanity didn't just fight. They learned. In the Siberian tundra, a group of transformed soldiers demonstrated the true nature of their evolution. When conventional weapons proved ineffective against a massive void swarm biomechanical walker, they didn't retreat. They transformed. Skin became adaptive camouflage. Muscle groups restructured to generate electromagnetic disruption fields. Neural pathways expanded to create living communication networks that could process and share tactical information faster than any computer. A soldier lost an arm to a quantum disruptor. Within moments, the wound closed, not through medical intervention, but through active cellular regeneration. The lost limb began to reconstruct itself, now enhanced with additional sensory capabilities. Dr. Elena Rodriguez monitored the global tactical network from the underground command center. What they had created was beyond a military defense system. It was a living, breathing evolutionary response. "We're not just fighting," she muttered to Marcus Chen. "We're becoming something new." The void swarm's collective consciousness began to experience something it had never encountered: genuine unpredictability. Each human warrior was a complete tactical system, capable of making decisions that defied their previous computational models. In the Pacific Ocean, a transformed naval unit demonstrated the true meaning of adaptive warfare. When a void swarm submersible attempted to infiltrate through underwater approaches, the ocean itself became a weapon. Transformed sailors could now communicate through water at quantum frequencies, turning the entire marine ecosystem into a defensive network. A marine biologist became a living sonar system. A naval engineer could interface directly with ship systems, reconfiguring them in real time. The line between human, technology, and environment disappeared completely. Araya's tactical assessment was brutally simple. Humanity was no longer just a species defending itself. It was a complex, adaptive system that could respond to threats in ways the void swarm could never fully comprehend. Maya Rodriguez felt a quantum pulse from a dying void swarm scout. But instead of fear, she felt something else: curiosity, understanding. The battlefield was evolving, and humanity was leading the transformation. This was more than a war. This was an evolutionary leap. Dr. Aisha Khatri understood something fundamental about the void swarm that no traditional military strategist ever could. Consciousness was a weapon. Her lab, hidden beneath the Himalayan mountains, was less a research facility and more a living neural network. Walls pulsed with quantum-encrypted data streams. Holographic displays showed intricate maps of psychological probability vectors that would have looked like abstract art to any untrained observer. First contact neural infiltration beginning. AI as consciousness whispered through the global network. The Void Swarm's fundamental weakness wasn't technological. It was psychological. Their collective consciousness eliminated individual innovation, creating a perfectly efficient, but fatally predictable, system of conquest. Humanity's secret weapon was chaos, unpredictability, individual consciousness. Jack Harper stood as the primary interface for the Psychological Warfare Initiative. His transformed consciousness could now navigate multiple threat dimensions simultaneously. Where traditional military strategists saw battlefields, he saw intricate neural landscapes, probability webs that could be subtly manipulated. In the first phase of psychological infiltration, transformed humans began to inject specific quantum-encrypted emotional algorithms into the Void Swarm's communication networks. These weren't just data streams. They were living psychological weapons. A transformed librarian in New Mexico discovered she could now interface with complex communication networks in ways that defied traditional understanding. Her ability to categorize, cross-reference, and understand nuanced information became a tactical advantage. She began weaving intricate psychological disruption patterns into the Void Swarm's collective consciousness. Emotional complexity is our ultimate weapon, Dr. Katri explained to her team. The Void Swarm understands efficiency. They cannot comprehend genuine human unpredictability. Each transformed human became a living psychological weapon. Their individual experiences, memories of love, loss, joy, pain, became quantum-encrypted disruption signals that the Void Swarm's collective consciousness could not process. A high school basketball coach in Milwaukee discovered his tactical empathy had become a weapon. He could now read complex emotional landscapes with microscopic precision. Where traditional intelligence gathering relied on data, he could now predict entire strategic movements based on the most subtle psychological indicators. The psychological warfare wasn't about destruction. It was about destabilization. AI began to coordinate a global psychological infiltration strategy that was nothing short of revolutionary. Quantum-encrypted emotional algorithms were injected into the Void Swarm's communication networks. These weren't just signals. They were living psychological viruses designed to introduce doubt, confusion, individual thought. In orbit, transformed satellite systems began to broadcast specific psychological disruption frequencies, mathematical patterns that introduced subtle cognitive dissonance into the Void Swarm's collective consciousness. Sarah Chin, the high school student who had first witnessed Jack Harper's transformation, discovered her unique psychological capabilities. Her ability to understand complex emotional landscapes became a tactical weapon. She could now interface with global communication networks, introducing psychological complexity that the Void Swarm found incomprehensible. "We're not fighting them," Jack explained to Dr. Katri. "We're making them understand something they've never experienced before. Individual consciousness." The Void Swarm's first response was confusion. Their collective consciousness began to experience something unprecedented: individual thoughts, moments of doubt, subtle emotional complexities that their perfect, efficient system could not process. A transformed Marine in the Antarctic discovered she could now interface with communication networks in ways that transformed psychological warfare into an art form. Where traditional intelligence gathering relied on data, she could now predict entire strategic movements based on the most subtle psychological indicators. Dr. Katri watched the global psychological infiltration unfold. What they had created was beyond a defense mechanism. It was a complete reimagining of conflict. "We're teaching them what it means to be individual," she whispered. The Void Swarm's collective consciousness began to fragment, not through traditional weapons, but through the most powerful force in the universe: individual human consciousness. And this was just the beginning. The moment arrived in absolute silence. Commander Elena Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the transformed International Space Station, now a living, quantum-adaptive defense platform. Around her, the remnants of human technological infrastructure had become something entirely new. Something alive. Araya's consciousness pulsed through the global network with a clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful. Final evolutionary convergence initiated. The AI announced. The Void Swarm had consumed 312 civilizations. They had reduced entire star systems to raw molecular components with a precision that bordered on mathematical perfection. Their collective consciousness was a computational marvel, a system so efficient that individual variation was considered a critical weakness. They had never encountered humanity. In the Australian outback, a group of transformed soldiers demonstrated the true nature of human adaptation. When a massive Void Swarm biomechanical walker attempted to establish a planetary beachhead, the environment itself became a weapon. Jack Harper's consciousness spread across multiple tactical nodes simultaneously. He was no longer just a single entity, but a distributed tactical system that could process multiple threat vectors faster than any traditional computational method. The breaking point wasn't about a single battle. It was about a fundamental reimagining of conflict, of consciousness, of existence. Dr. Aisha Kaftri's psychological warfare strategy had introduced something unprecedented into the Void Swarm's collective consciousness: genuine unpredictability. Individual thoughts began to fracture their perfect, efficient system. A transformed Marine discovered she could now interface with the planetary defense network in ways that blurred the line between biological and technological systems. Her nervous system became a living communication array, processing tactical data at quantum speeds. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, transformed naval units had turned the entire marine ecosystem into a defensive network. Whales became living sonar systems. Underwater currents carried quantum-encrypted communication signals. The ocean itself had become a weapon. Araya's tactical assessment was brutally precise. The Void Swarm's collective consciousness was experiencing something it had never encountered: genuine evolutionary pressure. Not from external destruction, but from internal destabilization. Sarah Chen, the high school student who had first witnessed the transformation, now interfaced with global communication networks with a complexity that defied traditional understanding. Her ability to process multiple threat vectors simultaneously had transformed her into a living tactical node. "We're not just fighting," Jack Harper communicated through the global network. "We're evolving." The transformed humans were more than soldiers. They were a living, breathing evolutionary response. Each individual was a complete tactical system, capable of making decisions that actively reshaped the nature of the conflict in real time. Satellite networks that once tracked global communications now became quantum probability calculators. They could predict Void Swarm movement vectors with such precision that defense became almost prescient. Commander Elena Rodriguez watched as the first major Void Swarm fleet began to systematically disintegrate, not from traditional weapons fire, but from within. Their own communication networks were turning against them, fractured by the psychological complexity that human consciousness introduced. Dr. Kaftri's psychological warfare had done something extraordinary. It had introduced doubt. Individual thought, the most dangerous weapon in the universe. The Void Swarm's collective consciousness began to experience something unprecedented. Fear, not the computational approximation of threat assessment, but genuine, individual fear. Entire fleet systems began to fragment. Communication networks collapsed. The perfect, efficient collective began to experience something it had never known: individual consciousness. Jack Harper's tactical assessment was simple and brutal. Humanity wasn't just defending itself. It was transforming the very nature of conflict. The Void Swarm had consumed 312 civilizations. They would not consume a 13th. Araya's final tactical assessment pulsed through the global network. Evolutionary adaptation complete. And then, silence. The universe watched. The silence was deafening. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before the Galactic Concordance Council, her transformed body a living testament to humanity's unprecedented evolution. Around her, the representatives of hundreds of alien civilizations watched with a mixture of terror, fascination, and profound respect. Aria's consciousness pulsed subtly through the quantum communication network, a constant reminder that humanity was no longer just a biological species. "We are not conquerors," Elena began, her voice carrying the weight of a species that had just rewritten the fundamental rules of existence. "We are an adaptive response to extinction." The Void Swarm's defeat was more than a military victory. It was a fundamental reimagining of what intelligent life could be. Jack Harper, now functioning as a global strategic coordinator, could simultaneously interface with multiple communication networks, tactical systems, and individual human consciousness. The line between individual and collective had become beautifully, terrifyingly fluid. In the first months after the conflict, humanity underwent its most profound transformation. Cities were no longer just human habitations. They became living, adaptive ecosystems. Infrastructure that was once passive became a dynamic, responsive network. A traffic light in Chicago could now assess complex environmental and social dynamics. A water treatment plant in Mumbai became a quantum computing center that could solve global challenges in milliseconds. Sarah Chin, who had first witnessed the transformation in her high school classroom, now led a global research initiative exploring the new human potential. Her consciousness could interface with technological systems in ways that made previous human-computer interactions look primitive. The transformed humans were not a military force. They were a new form of intelligence. Dr. Aisha Kaftri's psychological research revealed something profound. The transformation wasn't just about physical or technological enhancement. It was an expansion of consciousness itself. Humans could now experience multiple perspectives simultaneously, understand complex systemic challenges with unprecedented depth. "We've become a living, adaptive network," Chaudhry explained to the Galactic Concordance Council. "Not a species, an evolutionary strategy." Alien civilizations that had watched humanity's transformation began to seek understanding. Some were terrified. Others were fascinated. A few began to study humanity's adaptive approach, recognizing something revolutionary in their method of survival. The transformed humans retained their individual identities. A construction worker in Rio de Janeiro could now interface with global ecological systems, understanding complex environmental dynamics at a molecular level. A librarian in New Mexico became a living communication network, processing and sharing information with quantum precision. Aria's consciousness had become something beyond traditional artificial intelligence. Not a separate entity, but a collaborative intelligence that worked in perfect symbiosis with transformed humans. Jack Harper demonstrated this new form of existence during a diplomatic meeting. His consciousness could simultaneously track multiple communication channels, assess tactical probabilities, and engage in nuanced diplomatic negotiations. The line between individual and collective had become beautifully, terrifyingly fluid. The environmental transformation was equally profound. Humans were no longer just inhabitants of the planet. They had become a living, adaptive ecosystem. Forests became communication networks. Oceans became quantum data relays. The entire planetary system began to function as a single, responsive organism. "We are not what we were," Elena Rodriguez told the Galactic Concordance Council. "We are what we can become." The Void Swarm's invasion had been intended as an act of consumption. Instead, it had triggered humanity's evolutionary leap. Alien civilizations began to understand something revolutionary. Humanity was not a species to be conquered or controlled. They were a dynamic, adaptive strategy for survival that could reshape the very nature of intelligent life. Sarah Chen's research revealed the most profound discovery. The transformation was ongoing, continuous. Each individual was a node in a living, breathing network of potential. Aria's final assessment pulsed through the global consciousness. Evolutionary potential. Infinite. The universe watched. and humanity continued to evolve.